Hello and welcome to Grand Prix London. I'm Tim Willoughby, here with Simon Gertson, and we're ready to bring you a whole host of Gatecrash fun. This is the very first Grand Prix that we've had with the new Gatecrash format. We've got 10 rounds, we've already gone through our 3 buys, so we've got plenty of action still to show you from today. Then tomorrow moving into Gatecrash drafts, all ahead of the Pro Tour next weekend in Montreal, where we're going to get a chance to see how Gatecrash works out in standard. So a bit of a Gatecrash fest really, Simon.
Yeah, this is the big premier event with Gatecrash, and it's going to be very interesting what the pros and the non-pros have cooked up for Limited.
Absolutely, it's interesting. We've got probably slightly more pros that have travelled to this one than we might normally see in European GP, travel from slightly further afield. But on top of that, actually, this is one where more people have travelled full stop. This is actually the largest English Grand Prix that we've had of all time. We've got 1,970 players, which actually, if you took the next biggest English GP and then the next biggest English GP after that and put them together, we're still bigger. It's an absolutely colossal event, and we've got quite the show for you today. We've already done a few little bits and pieces looking at how people are building their decks, and we'll be able to see some of that coming through in the feed over in between games for the rest of the weekend. But fairly soon we're going to be moving to our very first feature match. The players are just sitting down. We'll be able to move across to that shortly. In the meantime, is there anything particular you're really hoping to look out for in terms of sealed deck for this Gatecrash format today?
I think the biggest question for me is, are people going to stick to 2 colors, go with the guilds, or are they going to be crazy 3-color decks, maybe even 4 or 5-color decks? We have some mana fixing, we have the guilds, it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, typically most sealed deck formats, you find yourself playing 2 colors and maybe a small splash. So will we see that the most powerful decks in the room are the ones that are able to go just in 1 guild, or is it that actually being safe and making sure that all 23 or so spells and your 17 lands are all doing as much as they can? I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, one thing that's for certain is Gruul and Boros are certainly going to keep the other decks fair. If you are going too much for the late game, if you try to be control-ish with 7 and 8 drops, you are just going to die to battalion creatures, to blood rush creatures, and you have to be really careful. It is a very fast format, I believe.
And we'll see that potentially, I mean, in draft it might be even faster than in sealed, but there's really not that much room to misstep even in sealed deck here. We've got 7 rounds to find out quite how fast the format is, but judging by the pace that things have been moving at so far today, it's certainly not one where you can rest on your laurels and hope that come turn 7 you can cast your big 7-drop bomb.
No, not at all. So if you are looking at your rares, you might want to consider the ones that only cost 3 mana rather than those that cost 7.
And actually, we've already spoken to a few players about the way that they build and sort of what their top rares in the format are. Almost inevitably, some of the lower cost ones in the field. Now we've just received our notification of what our feature matches are, and it looks like we have 2 matches on camera today. We'll be moving across to them very shortly. Everyone just moving in to sit down. On table 1, which is the one that we'll be starting on, we have Bernd Brendemühl of Germany against Hannes Karim from Estonia. We then have Richard Bland flying the flag for England here in London, playing against Robert Darnhofer of Germany. On text we'll be seeing, reading about, I suppose, Christian Calcano versus David Reitbauer, and then Kenny Oberg from Sweden against Jan Bangert. So plenty of great players here in the field. They're just sitting down, making sure they're all at the right tables, able to get started on play. It'll be interesting to see whether or not there's some consistency in which guilds are being played, or actually whether or not it's been more dictated by a few powerful cards, perhaps.
It's not unusual to see certain colors being more popular in sealed. You can usually check with the land stations to find out what people are preferring, and I didn't do that, but we might want to get a word from the judges. Who knows, maybe all the forests are gone.
Green often one of the more popular colours in sealed decks, simply because if you are going to have to play 3 colours, then that colour fixing obviously very important and most abundant within the colour of abundance.
We saw Kenny Oberg walk through the screen there. I think he's in the feature matches at European GPs more often than not. I love covering him. He has a very nice style of play. But we're going to look at Bernd Brendemühl first, I believe.
That's correct, yeah. Playing against Hannes Karim from Estonia. Karem, sorry there, make sure we get my pronunciation correct. I'm sure that within the chat you'll be quite happy to point out to me anywhere that I'm mispronouncing either any of the cards or the players' names. I'll be aiming to do as little as possible of either.
We are appreciative of any kind of feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. If you see something in the chat you want to let us know about, we will be monitoring it and doing our best to feed off that where we can. But obviously we've got plenty of stimulation as well just from watching these matches, so there'll be plenty going on from just the moment they're ready to start playing. And we have actually received the deck lists through of the players that are playing in the feature match area, so just a little bit of a heads up on what we can expect to see out of these two players. So it looks like Hannes Karim is playing effectively an Esper deck, so he's got a mix of islands, plains and swamps there, whereas on the other side of things we have Bernd Brendamule, who...
Yeah, I have Bernd Brendamule here.
Here we go.
So he's actually playing 6 forests, 6 mountains and 2 plains, supported by a mix of Guildgate. So that looks like he's Gruul, but opting for a White Splash, for a Boros Splash.
And we won't try and spoil too much about the actual cards that they're playing at this stage. Obviously, we want to make sure that we get to feel the full impact of perhaps where that splash comes through while they're playing. But both players here having at least a little bit of white in their deck, but otherwise we're seeing all 5 colours.
Yeah, interestingly enough, and I'm pretty sure that the white in the dimmer Orzhov deck is going to serve a very different role from the White Splash in the Gruul deck.
Absolutely. One side of it perhaps more extort focused, the other one potentially more about some of those more aggressive Boros cards that can just support the Gruul strategy.
Karam's mana base does look a bit ambitious if you ask me, but we are going to see how that works out for him. Playing 6 islands and 5 of each, plains and swamp. Who knows? He probably has a plan for those cards.
So each player having just shuffled up there, looking at their opening 7, just trying to decide whether or not to mulligan. Brendamule on the play.
That's a good start.
Absolutely, one of the most powerful starts that one can make within the format in terms of 1-drops there. That the Cloudfin Raptor, assuming that there's a creature to follow up from Hannes, this Cloudfin Raptor starts off as a 0/1 for 1 with flying, nothing too impressive there, but thanks to the evolve mechanic it can potentially get rather out of hand rather quickly. So we see there that immediately Metropolis Sprite comes down for Hannes Karim. This is one that it's a 1/2 for 1 and a blue with flying again, but he can pay 1 blue mana just to switch up 1 point of power in return for losing 1 point of toughness. So potentially quite the air force there.
Brendamule adds an Ember Beast to his what's it called? Gate.
Yeah, so he's already working on a fairly formidable board there. The 2/1 that you're talking about there is
Greenside Watcher, I believe.
That's the one, yes. And assuming that he ever is able to get a Guildgate in play, that Greenside Watcher will be able to tap to untap a Guildgate, so potentially fixing his mana a little bit as well.
On the other hand, the Ember Beast makes Karam very aware of the advantage it has to keep like a blocker here, simply because getting rid of one of the creatures basically deals with the Ember Beast as well. We see the first
Blood Rush in the game. And actually,
activation.
A particularly powerful Blood Rush there, based on the fact that Hannes Karim does not have any of his black mana to enable his dutiful Thrall to be able to regenerate. Currently stuck on Azorius mana, which might well be perfectly reasonable once Dragon's Maze comes along, but right now, Azorius isn't really a guild that he needs to worry about too much. He needs to either manage to put together his Dimir or his Orzhov, or he might find himself on the back foot in this game.
Yeah, and Bernd is actually showing the power of Blood Rush just on this turn. With the help of Miming Slime, he has built himself a 4/4 Ooze token, just like, it's designed to be used, I suppose.
So yeah, Miming Slime, 2 colorless and a green for a sorcery. That means that Bernd was able to put an Ooze into play with power and toughness equal to the highest power amongst his team. Now normally that would have been the Ember Beast, but because he'd already attacked and used Blood Rush, all of a sudden he found himself with a 4-power creature in play, albeit briefly, but just long enough for him to be able to make a 4/4 token.
following up Clothefin Raptor with a 1/2 flyer and a 1/1 that you don't have the mana to regenerate is certainly not what Hannes was looking to do.
And Metropolis Sprite, actually a card I hold in relatively high regard, assuming that you can either get something ciphered onto it with one of the Dimir cards, or find any way of pumping it at all. A Zertar Swine there from Burnt Brendamule, the 5/4 for 5 with a 3-cost Blood Rush as well, so a very powerful creature either when being used as a regular creature or a spell. And Brendamule really showing quite what Gruul can do here, not too worried about not having his planes because he's got a huge amount of power on the board.
He already put Hannes down to 10, and yeah, the creatures on the left side of the board just aren't up to the challenge of stopping the Boros. The Gruul
offensive.
Flam.
Yeah. And here we see Brendamule. He's found his white mana, and it looked like he had just drawn an Angelic Edict, which means that he will have a removal spell available as and when he needs it. Kareem there, the 1 extra card that he's added to the board, Court Street Denizen, the 2/2 for 3 mana that whenever he plays a white creature, he gets to tap one of his opponent's creatures.
Which is an amazing card on offense, but doesn't really help you on defense.
Right now it's not serving the purpose that he needs, and he's actually dropped a 2 already on those attacks. Able there to trade off and take down the Ooze, but ultimately not nearly enough, facing down a very aggressive start from Burnt Brendamule.
Yes. Missing one of your colors against a Gruul deck on the play that curves out like Vance did was brutal.
So we're going to have a quick look across at the other match now, given that we've finished that one quite as quickly as we have. And here we see we've got Simic against Orzhov. It doesn't look like we've got any trouble here in terms of mana. Bland on the right there has a Prophetic Prison to help his, and already has potentially quite an impressive attacker. He's got the Hands of Binding ciphered onto his creature there, which means that the Deathless Angel on the other side of the board is not nearly as scary as it might otherwise be. So the Death Pact Angel there. For black, white, and 3, we see that there's a 5/5 flyer that, as and when it does die, should it in fact die, it leaves behind a 1/1 token, a Cleric token that you can pay Death Pact Angel's casting cost again and sacrifice the token to get it right back into play.
Richard used a Totally Lost there to buy himself one turn, and being able to copy Hands of Binding handled the Angel for another turn. But currently we aren't seeing a long-term solution. Oh, that might be a way to get into this game.
So Biovisionary comes along now. Biovisionary,
Master Biomancer.
I apologise. Yes, Master Biomancer there, a 2/4 that now from now on, whenever Richard Bland plays another creature, it's going to come into play with a number of +1/+1 counters equal to the power of his creature. Now, normally that would be good enough on its own. He's followed up with a Pit Fight to force a fight between that Biomancer and the one lone blocker on the other side of the board, that Kingpin's Pet. Now, unfortunately for Bland there, that fight didn't work out quite as he might have hoped it to.
Aerial Maneuver saved the pet, and because of First Strike, it also held off the green side Watcher. So that was pretty good use of a combat trick.
Yeah, normally we do refer to them as combat tricks. That not quite your traditional combat, in as much as it wasn't during the combat step, but as a fight, it was a very important one, and it's really opened the door to that Angel potentially taking control of the game.
Especially with every spell triggering Extort as well. You will usually just see the players tap an additional mana and then imply that this has triggered. A lot of life total changes going on with Orzhov.
So Kingpin's Pet swinging in, and oh look, there's a second one, immediately extorting off the first. In spite of the fact that that Master Biomancer is in play, one has to think that Richard Bland is potentially in quite a bit of trouble here.
Yes. Robert is out of cards with 8 lands in play, so if he hits a couple of lands, he might succumb to the power of the Master Biomancer, but he truly isn't feeling too bad about the game state.
So we can already see quite how much those life totals are changing thanks to Extort. But A Croconura here from Richard Bland might actually be exactly the sort of answer that he was looking for. It naturally starts out as a 1/3 reach evolved creature for 3, but because of that Master Biomancer, it's already a 3/5, and if he can pump it just the once, which he's successfully done by casting a Zamek Guildmage, so he's been able to evolve there, all of a sudden he's got a 3/6 blocker, and that means that that 5/5 flyer is not nearly as exciting. So it looks like we're back on the other match now, and Hannes Karem has had to mulligan 6, but what do we notice here about the lands in play? It looks like there's been some fairly substantial sideboarding going on.
It looks like he took a mulligan on his color choices as well, going for the complete opposite, and actually moving into a mirror with Bernd Brandemühl.
One has to think that that's potentially a dangerous proposition, simply because if Brandemühl was confident enough with his Gruul deck to start with, then perhaps Karem is going to be second place in terms of card quality again.
Especially after starting off with a mulligan on the play. That's actually pretty dangerous in the mirror. If things go evenly, then you just basically trade a lot of times, and that means the player with more cards is going to advance. Even in the highly aggressive matchups, can become quite grindy.
And Disciple of the Old Ways versus Ember Beast is the only difference in terms of creatures on the board. And a mugging, oh, that mugging actually getting trumped by, it looks, yeah, so that was a burst of strength there to put a +1/+1 counter. Now, it's now a 3/3. It still can't block because of the mugging, so Brandemühl keen to get in the points where he can, but a slightly closer race. I'm sure that Brandemühl would have been much happier just to get that Disciple of the Old Ways off the board.
Definitely, and that's because with the first strike activation threatening his 2/1 to just not be able to attack, and then the Ember Beast, and yeah, getting rid of that Disciple would have been very, very valuable. And we actually see now that Bernd is most likely being forced to go on the defensive here.
And going on the defensive against a Warmind infantry with 2 friends to make battalion happen is not necessarily where you want to be. So that a towering Thunderfist from Brandemühl, and he does have the white mana to be able to make that 4/4 creature for 5 have vigilance where he needs it to. Not only the largest creature on the board, but also one that is able to work on both offense and defense.
Just like in Return to Ravnica, we see that 4 toughness is kind of where you want to be. We see that the battalion can push creatures above 3 power, but otherwise there aren't that many creatures that have a natural power of 4 or greater. So yeah, that Thunderfist seems like a really good choice for sealed deck, and pretty obviously the Ember Beast as well.
And Zertash Swine, one of the few common creatures that can actually get above 4 toughness quite happily, though it will only be able to trade with that towering Thunderfist. In point of fact, I'm genuinely a big fan of 2/3 creatures in this format as well. It seems like 2 power is the starting point for power levels in this format, and having a 2/3 can sometimes be enough to just get you into the mid game against the aggressive decks like the Boros decks.
And it does enable all the potential double blocks for which you need some toughness.
An Angelic Edict there, making sure that Zertar Swine is well out of the game, completely exiled in fact. Helpful also that sorcery has the potential to remove problem enchantments. They're not necessarily as big a part of the game, but it's convenient to be able to have an answer that doesn't take up too much space being a dead card if there's not a target.
And Bernd is keeping on the pressure here, forcing Karem to block, and he's happy to trade his 4/4 with the Disciple that's potentially first striking.
And also this now means that Karem not in a position where he has battalion active, which means that Warmind infantry not quite as scary. It starts off as a 2/3 for 3. It does of course become a 4 power creature with battalion. And that was a marked for death there, immediately killing off Brandemühl's creature, meaning that Karem able to get a little bit of a swing in. That Ember Beast all of a sudden showing up its one weakness. As a 3/4 for 3, it's a very efficient creature, but unfortunately on its own, it's not brave enough to either attack or block.
So what looked like a good trade for Brandemil there with his 4/4, the Towering Thunderfist, was actually kind of an unfortunate thing, because his Ember Beast is now out of things to do. There was an Adaptive Snapjaw.
Very briefly, and Arrows of Justice shot it down. Adaptive Snapjaw, an interesting one. It's one of the comparatively few evolved creatures that tends to evolve more from having low toughness than low power. It starts off as a 5/2 for 5, and there's another one.
6/2.
Sorry, 6/2 for 5, and then because it's got a low toughness, anytime a creature with a higher toughness comes along, it will get its +1/+1 counter. Obviously, if you happen to play something with an even higher power, that works too. But one way or another, it can evolve very large very quickly. Now, in terms of creatures that can trump the Snapjaw just immediately, Ruination Worm, one of them, and actually, for my money, one of the really important commons from Gruul. A 7/6 creature for 4 colorless, a red and a green, and an absolute roadblock for many decks, and potentially the Abyss. It can attack each turn and just kill a creature and potentially even survive a double block.
Yeah, when you are on 12, you actually have to be very aware of certain cards just outright killing you from the Gruul deck. So yeah, it's not an easy spot to be in.
I mean, anytime that Brandemil attacks at this point, Karem has to feel like there's some kind of a combat trick coming, and Gruul, thanks to Blood Rush, the color that has the most different tricks that it can play during combat. So,
wow,
this a very, very big play here from Brandemil. Clan Defiance. This for the cost of simply X, a red and a green, can deal damage to any combination of 3 following things. 1 creature, 1 player, 1 flyer. Now, Karem did not have a flyer, but Brandemil's certainly not unhappy to be able to kill Karem's potentially scariest creature, deal a little bit of damage to Karem himself, and enable an attack that now means that this is a very, very close race.
He did decide to leave open 1 mana. I was wondering what that was for, but yeah, he wanted the combat trick available.
So, moving across to the other match now. That game just finishing there. We'll try and find out who took it. When we were there previously, of course, we saw that Death Pact Angel was potentially playing nice with a couple of Kingpin's agents in order to be able to be creating an awkward position for Richard Bland. Those 2 Kingpin's Pet and Death Pact Angel, obviously quite the air force, but a Master Biomancer for Richard Bland means that it's not as if he's unable to deploy some real threats.
And Robert was out of spells, so I don't expect the extort creatures to actually have gotten there. It just looked too powerful with both Simic Guildmage and Master Biomancer and a way to block flyers. I think Richard Bland had a pretty good situation. Okay, so he did win with his Angel. That's what we're hearing from Rich here. Too bad we missed that. That was probably a pretty intense game.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting one in as much as both of those board states, given a little bit of time, could get quite out of hand. A Zamek Guildmage with Master Biomancer, of course. 2 abilities on that Guildmage. The first one being able to remove a +1/+1 counter from a creature in order to draw a card. Certainly with that many +1/+1 counters knocking about, it can potentially be very powerful. And then the ability to go over the top even further by paying a little bit of extra mana to make sure that when creatures come into play, they get even more +1/+1 counters.
And you can even stack the ability. So if you have 8 mana and you want to play a 2-drop, you can actually give it 3 +1/+1 counters.
So potentially, if he'd drawn the Zamek Guildmage before his Master Biomancer, he could have made sure that the Master Biomancer was bigger from the get-go, ultimately meaning that all of his other creatures were going to get even bigger in a big evolutionary mess. So each of these players shuffling up now, they've done essentially a little bit of sideboarding. Richard Bland at least had 3 buys, so he will almost certainly have had a bit of time to look at his build, figure out if there are any little tweaks that he wanted to make following the main deck construction period in particular matchups. Each player trying to confuse us with sleeves that are going to camouflage against the backdrop. Our cameras are too high definition for that. We'll make sure to keep track of all the action as they shuffle up, ready to play their second game. This, of course, not really a format where it's too likely that people are going to be completely forced to play or draw. That we know that there's very aggressive decks in the format, so in that regard you don't want to get stuck in a position too slow. But equally, sealed deck is a format where many times you do choose to be on the draw because the extra card's very important.
I believe so far there isn't really a true consensus being reached, neither in this format nor any other. A lot of people choose to draw, but it's not really clear if you're actually giving yourself the best chances to win. Because whenever you're on the draw, you have an opponent who's on the play who might just get that aggressive start he wants to beat you, and you have it's very easy to think that it's better to be on the draw, but then actually it's going to cost you.
And it, of course, very deck dependent and indeed matchup dependent. So it looks like both players here taking a mulligan. Just prior to them doing so, I believe that I spotted a Fathom Mage in Richard Bland's hand. Fathom Mage for 2 colourless, a blue and a green. A simple 1/1, but with Evolve potentially can get quite a bit bigger, and then any time that a +1/+1 counter is placed on Fathom Mage, you may draw a card. So potentially Richard Bland's deck, a bit of a powerhouse Simic theme deck, one must say.
Yeah, with some of the most powerful Simic uncomes and rares, it looks like.
And it looks like Richard Bland did choose to be on the draw, there with a Prophetic Prism to mean that he's drawing extra cards all sorts of different ways, potentially supporting a splash. Meanwhile, Robert Darnhofer with the first creature of the game. Once we get on a different angle, we should be able to pinpoint what that one is. It looks like it may be a Metropolis Sprite, but we will be able to tell more clearly in just a moment. Oh. Not even close.
Syndic of Tithe. Yeah, Robert doesn't have blue available, so he does have a powerful start with 2 Extort creatures, though.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that really where Extort becomes the most powerful is following up the Syndic of Tides with a Basilica Screecher. He's now in a position where, assuming that he's playing cheap threats, each of those cheap threats could also come with a 2-point drain.
And now, even though Richard has some of the more powerful Simic cards in his deck, he is playing blue-green, so getting rid of those extra creatures is almost impossible for him.
And potentially, I mean, it's worth thinking about the matchups between different guilds. Do you think that there's a very strong notion once you've played one game that once you know what guild someone is, actually that can quite easily translate into a decision about how you want to play the next game, simply based on guild?
Yes, definitely. And it could even lead to people going overboard and just sideboarding into a guild they feel is favored against whatever they are playing against.
And it looks like we have a bit of a chain of extortion going on. I'm sure that the Orzhov fans out there will be pleased to see that Basilica Guards representing for a very single-minded Orzhov attack here.
And we see Fathom Mage coming down. Robert does find a land, which is huge, because he now has up to 3 extra triggers for every spell he draws. So it's, once again, somewhat of a race. We saw the Kingpin's pets and the Angel basically racing the more powerful cards from Richard. And I think we might see something similar happening again with, Extort just...
Oh dear. A Balustrade Spy there. It's for 3 and a black coming down to be a 2/3 flyer that on top of that forces your opponent to put cards in their graveyard until they put a land in their graveyard. Only one card going in before the land, but that was the Master Biomancer, which I'm sure that Richard would have been quite happy to have in his hand instead. And a Death Cult Rogue, ensuring that Fathom Mage is able to evolve. But no attacks here from Richard, who is potentially in a bit of a sticky spot.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be in Richard's position here. He has no Guild Gate to untap. The Fathom Mage is only a 2/2 right now. Given that there is a Basilica Guards on Robert's side of the board, he can attack freely without being in any danger. And Richard on 12, that's just a few spells before Extort is going to take you out.
I mean, the worst nightmare for Richard Bland here may not in fact be the Angel so much as a small number of spells that cost 1 or 2 mana that are going to come with a large extortion cost on top.
It's possible that there's also Ospedad Ghost Council in Robert's hand, but I'm not sure exactly. He couldn't cast it because he has only 1 swamp, but we'll see in a minute.
And of course the Orzhov Guild Leader coming with its own little bit of extortion before you even worry about paying extra costs. It coming into play, causing an opponent to lose 2 life and you to gain 2 life, and being a 5/5 nonetheless. The final ability, of course, on Obzedat being that at the end of the turn you can remove it from the game, only to return it at the start of your next turn with haste and get that 2-point drain all over again. Now, Richard Bland gradually ticking up that Fathom Seer. We see that here he has a fairly sizable threat in the Sapphire Drake, not least because it now means that his Fathom Mage flies. It has +1/+1 counters on it, and what Sapphire Drake does is it says, I'm a 6 mana 4/4 flyer, but on top of that, any creatures you have in play with a +1/+1 counter, they can fly too.
So Richard could have in fact attacked with his Fathom Mage this turn, but opted not to. So he's just staying back on defense there.
And to be fair, on the life total he's on, that seems like a perfectly reasonable choice from him. We see that there's
Guardian of the Gateless coming down. One of the best uncomes in white, I believe.
And while in principle Guardian of the Gateless is a 3/3 flyer that can block any number of creatures and then get +1/+1 for each creature it blocks, obviously a fantastic blocker. But in this position that Robert Darnhofer finds himself in, simply being a 3/3 flyer is amply sufficient. He can just keep swinging in. It's going to be a difficult one for Richard Bland to answer one way or another. I mean, with a 4/4 flyer, it's not going to be swinging in anytime soon, but equally, Richard can't really go on the offensive here. Now we see the Evolve chain carrying on. Sometimes Fathom Mage can have a little bit of trouble getting beyond a 3/3, depending on the exact makeup of different people's decks. But an Adaptive Snapjaw with its 6 power, easily able to ensure that that evolution continues. And Darnhofer has to be a little bit concerned that potentially, as soon as that Snapjaw evolves, so as soon as Bland plays a creature with either power of 7 or toughness of 3, it's going to gain flying, which could be a real problem.
Robert hasn't been able to extort Richard for a while, so I think we've seen the tides turning here pretty convincingly. It doesn't look like the mass of extort creatures is what you really want when you are lacking lands in the early game.
And a ground assault there from Richard Bland, able to take the Guardian of the Gateless out. In spite of the fact it's called ground assault, this red and green sorcery can deal damage to flyers as well. It deals damage to target creature equal to the number of lands you control, and Richard Bland with plenty of lands to be able to make things happen there. So he attacks...
It's not an assault on the ground, it's the ground assaulting.
Absolutely. And we see there that Richard Bland able to bait a block there from Robert Darnhofer. Oftentimes you see that the Death Cult Rogue of Richard Bland is largely unblockable. It's a 2/2 that can only be blocked by rogues. And he attacked into the 2/3 Balustrade Spy, which is a rogue. but with an appropriate pump, he was able to take out the one flyer left for Dannhofer and potentially open up a whole world of attack. Sorry, one flyer apart from the little bat up there, the Basilica Screecher. There's now a huge air force on Richard Bland's side of the board, which could be quite a problem.
And Bland's creatures are just so huge. He has 7 power Snapjaw, 5 power Fathom Mage, 4 power Sapphire Drake. That adds up.
Yeah, with 11 life, Robert Dannhofer's got to be a little bit concerned here that he may be drawing short on numbers of turns left in this game. Richard Bland, though, this is not his first rodeo. He's taking things a little bit slowly, making sure that he's protected, not sort of in danger of losing anything he doesn't need to on attacks, and safe on any swingbacks.
When you have a card like Fathom Mage providing so much of an advantage, then there is no reason to be hasty with your attacking decisions.
And it looks like Richard Bland's squaring it up there, so we will go to a game of 3. It looks like Dannhofer perhaps thinking better of some of the cards in his main deck, going to the sideboard again, while Bland perhaps a little bit G'd up by that. Defending the home turf, he's quite happy to stick with the exact same 40 that he had in that game.
Yeah, you don't want to start round 4 with a loss. It's always, especially if you know that there's almost 2,000 players, you know every match counts for making that top 8 you certainly are set out to make.
Of course, yeah, with 3 buys, this may be the first proving background for many of the decks that you see in round 4. And from the looks of Bland's deck, it certainly has a lot of power. He must have been hoping to be able to get off to a good start, because in terms of making top 8, this round just as important as the final round on Sunday when the cut is finally made. He doesn't want to be in a position where he's giving up points anywhere.
And you certainly don't want to lose more than 3 matches throughout the tournament. So
absolutely,
if you are playing 10 on Saturday and another 6 on Sunday, you have your work cut out for you.
And this, of course, a new enough format that, in principle, there may be room to pick up a win here and there simply by being more familiar with the cards than your opponent. But the later on in the day you get, the less likely that is to be the case. While the experience curve, everyone's still kind of towards the beginning of it. Already we're starting to see that there's some players that have some fairly strong ideas about the format.
But then you still need things to fall into place, and you especially need to have a deck with a clear plan, I believe. And Richard's plan is clearly to just go over the top of what everybody else is doing. If his utility creatures like Fathom Mage and Master Biomancer survive, then I don't see many decks in this format that can stop or match what he's doing.
And because he's drawing so many cards, he's able to be quite consistent in enacting the plan that his deck has. So each player looking on here, no mulligans it would seem.
Pretty good starting hands from both players. We have lands and spells, first of all, but we also have a double Kingpin's Pet.
Now, Kingpin's Pet, a card that I hold in very high regard in terms of what Orzhov's doing. Obviously, the extort mechanic we've seen is a powerful one, but having a 2/2 flyer for 3 just on its own is equally a very effective threat. Zamek Guildmage there, one that we mentioned a little bit earlier on. A chance to really see the power of this Guildmage potentially, as it's come down as the very first creature of the game.
Zamek Guildmage is really, really interesting because in the beginning of the game it has almost no utility at all, but in the late game it just outperforms almost all of the guild mages.
Now, an interesting card we saw in Richard Bland's hand there, another rare to go in the Richard Bland rare show, it would seem, Nightveil Spectre. Now this one, a 2/3 flyer, which will match up very well against these 2 Kingpin's Pets we see from Dannhofer. But it does cost Dimir, which may not be the easiest of costs for Bland's deck to achieve. Once it's in play though, it's got kind of a nifty ability. when it attacks and deals combat damage to a player, you exile the top card of that player's library, and then you can choose to play the cards that have been exiled with Nightveil Spectre, as long as Nightveil Spectre remains in play. Now, this is a card that I had at the pre-release, and I found it to be something of a lightning rod. It was one that it frustrated so many players seeing their cards being played against them that they were just very keen to get it off the board as soon as possible. And Bland's mana good enough that not only can he now play that Spectre, but he can activate Zamek Guildmage's first ability beforehand, meaning that it comes into play with a +1/+1 counter, and as a 3/4, all of a sudden a big problem for Dawnhofer in terms of how he's meant to deal with it.
Certainly can't afford to attack with his pets anymore, so...
He cannot even profitably double block now, so...
As long as the Spectre is removing white cards, it shouldn't be a problem. But, well,
as soon as it removes the planes,
yeah,
or a swamp, it will potentially turn on any cards that it steals from Dawnhofer. And I'm guessing that initially Bland quite happy to effectively be drawing extra cards as long as he draws a land off the top of Dawnhofer's deck.
And Richard is also playing Prismatic Prism, so it's not out of the question to just be able to play these at some point.
Yeah, having access to Prophetic Prism just to ensure that he has that off-color mana, I'm sure just one of the considerations going into Bland's deck building. A seasoned player who thinks about all of the angles when he's putting together decks.
See a very interesting decision here by Robert to attack with both of his creatures. Bluffing a combat trick, basically, but I suppose it's going to turn out to be Executioner's Swing here.
And there it is.
So it did cost Robert 2 cards to deal with that Spectre, but yeah, he probably had to take that line here.
And it looks like another Kingpin's Pet in Dawnhofer's hand. He's the most firmly Orzhov deck that I've actually seen in the room so far today, against one of the most clearly Simic. An interesting way to get a good idea about how the overall matchup goes potentially.
It's quite interesting that he decided against playing the third pet, and just sitting there with his spells.
Now, Metropolis Sprite with a +1/+1 counter, an awful lot scarier than Metropolis Sprite without one. For 1 colorless and 1 blue, it starts off as a 1/2 flyer that you can pay a blue mana to get +1 power and -1 toughness. Now that it's effectively a 2/3, there's lots more potential for it to grow and deal more damage in combat.
It's not quite morphling, but it's getting there.
It's morphing into morphling, if you will.
Robert trying to figure out how to use Extor to its best ability. Is that another Extor creature he played there?
That looks to be a Balustrade Spy, so it's milled another Metropolis Sprite and then an island from Richard Bland's deck. Balustrade Spy, the 2/3 flyer, of course, that mills to a land when it comes into play.
Which people have been advocating for landless legacy decks already.
But within this format, we mentioned earlier on that 2/3, a very respectable size of creature that can deal with a lot of the 2/2s in the format, and then with irrelevant ability on top.
Talking about relevant abilities, that Guildmage has been doing amazing work.
Absolutely. Every turn we see Bland opting to be able to play his creatures just a little bit larger for a little bit of extra mana, effectively meaning that all of his cards are just that much better. And Dawnhofer here, without that +1/+1 counter on Metropolis Sprite, we would see a very different board state indeed. Here he attacks in with his 2/2 flyer and 2/3 flyer, and Bland potentially able to engineer a one-sided combat.
Maybe with the help of aerial maneuver, which we saw in game 1.
I mean, Bland has to think that there might be a trick here, but presumably he doesn't. If there's going to be a trick, he's going to have to get it out of Dawnhofer's hand at some point anyway.
I'm not sure what Robert is thinking about. I mean, if he attacks with both of his creatures, he has to be aware of that sprite blocking. Oh, okay.
And
Yeah,
aerial maneuver is there to make sure that that is still a profitable attack for him.
Robert opting against paying the extort cost, rather be dropping 2 spells this turn.
And with Kingpin's Pet alongside its brother and the Balustrade Spy, Darnhofer here ruling the skies, and Bland with enough land that he can potentially now be thinking about activating that Zamet Guildmage more than once when he casts his next creature.
It's also important to know that every creature you kill that has a +1/+1 counter on it is another card that Richard can draw with the help of his Guildmage.
A cheeky little attack from Richard Bland there, and one that Darnhofer not too worried about blocking. On 21 life as he stands, he doesn't need to worry too much about every single point right now, whereas Richard Bland on 11, facing down a couple of extort creatures and 3 flyers, is not able to live with that sort of luxury.
Yeah, a blocker this turn, a flying blocker, would be what Richard needs here, because all the cards in the world aren't going to save you when you're low on life against 2 extort pets.
And extort really the perfect example of inevitability. If the game goes on long enough and you have an extort creature, you're able to set up a fairly untenable board position. Richard Bland there choosing to draw an extra card with his Zamet Guildmage at the cost of a +1/+1 counter. And looks like that may have been a pit fight that he just drew, which is definitely one that he's not going to be sad to see while facing down this sort of a board, though any pit fight would be trading one of his creatures for one of Darnhofer's.
He does have that Simic Key Rune, which he might just activate, but that does mean that he isn't advancing his board any further.
Right, making the most of Darnhofer being tapped out, yeah. So it looks like he did use the Key Rune there to ensure that he didn't lose a creature. Obviously, Simic Key Rune just big enough to be able to get in a fight with a 2/2 without it being too painful. But if we're talking about pain, look what it is. We've got more Extort coming down. This time, Extort in the form of...
Syndicate Enforcer?
That's the one, yes. So a 3/2 rogue, potentially relevant if it's in the face of any of the other rogues in the format. Most notably Death Cult Rogue, of course, which can only be blocked by rogues, but mainly just piling on the pressure with these Extort creatures.
Really looks like a favorable matchup for the Orzhov guild. Playing against Simic, which has trouble dealing with your Extort creatures, but isn't as aggressive as some of the other strategies, makes me want to be on the Orzhov side of that. Even though Richard's deck is amazing.
Absolutely. So Zamet Guildmage, meaning that there's the Death Cult Rogue of which we spoke, coming down immediately as a 3/3. Now, it would still currently be trading with the only other rogue on the board, the Syndicate Enforcer, but certainly much happier it being a little bit larger than anything else. And a Ground Assault there, dealing with the third of Darnhofer's Kingpin's Pets. We have exited the Kingpin's Pet part of the game now, perhaps.
An interesting card in Robert's hand is Undercity Plague, which I wasn't too sure if we would see this during the sealed deck building part of today.
Undercity Plague, of course, the 6 mana sorcery, 4 colorless, 2 black, that causes your opponent to sacrifice a permanent, lose a life and discard a card, and then can get ciphered onto a creature for potential repeat usage.
It looks like Robert might have found a better way to win the game, though, with another aerial maneuver.
It's always the last aerial maneuver that gets you, eh? So it looks like we're just moving on to the third match on our list now, which is David Reitbauer versus Christian Calcano. So a little bit of roving reporting going on. We can see our Stephen Leeming, our cameraman, rapidly moving things around. So On our left-hand side, we've got Christian Calcano, and here he is playing against David Reitbauer of Austria. Now, Calcano, a lot of power in his deck. We can see that where perhaps Richard Bland wasn't able to fully exploit Death Cult Rogue, when it's also got +1/+1 on lifelink, it's really a very, very powerful creature indeed. While Metropolis Sprite is a rogue which potentially could block it, it's not in a position where it can do so particularly profitably.
And we see an Orzhov against Simic matchup once again. Life totals are 10 to 12. I think that Calcano is on 10 and David on 12.
The difference here, the amount of unblockability on the Simic side of the board, where previously Richard Bland was having to fight through the hard way, if you will, between all of the various blockers that were available to the Orzhov deck. This time round, he finds himself in the Orzhov deck up against an elusive Krasis, not able to finally find any way of staying in the game. Christian Calcano packing up his cards there.
Yeah, the Blood Rush on Scabclan Charger did the final points that David needed to finish this game.
Now, Scabclan Charger, not necessarily what you'd normally consider the most aggressive of the Blood Rush creatures, but they're all combat tricks, and in fact, all the matches we saw there, combat tricks playing a very real part. Aerial Predation in the Orzhov deck proving just as effective as Blood Rush for the Gruul and for, as it turns out, the Simic decks.
Yes, even though it's just a minor effect, +1/+1, but flying, first strike, and that additional power and toughness just make for a very efficient package.
So this a very creature-based format, as we see with most sealed deck, but don't forget about those combat tricks, because actually they're called tricks for a reason. Sometimes you can just fool your opponent into thinking they've not got the right blocking potential and steal a game out from perhaps where it didn't seem possible. So that's our last game on this round, though, so we're going to be taking a short break fairly shortly, except for... We have one of our prepared videos ready to show you now. So this is kind of a fun one. We've filmed a few of these videos over the course of today thus far. We're talking about draft archetypes. Now, we will be drafting mainly tomorrow, apart from any diehards who really want to draft through the night tonight after they've played their 10 rounds of sealed deck today. But tomorrow people will be drafting, and in order to give you an idea of how some of those draft archetypes might work, we've got a couple of players just to build a sample deck. So we're going to run across to a VT now where we get to find out what the sample decks might look like for initially Boros and Simic. Hello and welcome to Grand Prix London. We're here to look at some of the Gatecrash draft archetypes where we've managed to draft in a few pros to build some sample draft decks. A slightly unusual feature here, we've got every single card from each of the guilds, and each of our pros, so we've got Antti Malin here, former world champion, he's working with Boros. He's allowed exactly one rare from the Boros guild. He's then allowed up to 2 copies of any common and up to 1 copy of any uncommon, just so we can get a sense of where the Boros draft decks are really coming from. It's me, Tim Willoughby, here in the booth with Simon Gertzen, having a look to see what we're doing with each of the guilds.
And the interesting part about this isn't necessarily what people are going to draft tomorrow, but it's what the pros have in mind when they think of a guild like Boros.
Absolutely, yeah. So we see that Antti started off with the commons, and that's often a great way of thinking about draft archetypes because they're what you're going to see the most of in any draft. So he's already putting all of his creatures on a curve, and I think that says a lot about how Antti views Boros, and we see that that curve actually stops at 3. Oh, sorry, we got one 4-drop in Cinder Elemental so far.
Stops at 4, basically.
My apologies, yeah. Not that many 1-drops to choose from, and potentially that means that they're at a little bit of a premium.
Yeah, Boros Elite, one of the few 1-drops the Boros deck has available. And yeah, I think he's just looking through all of his options here. Exercises like this are actually very, well, let's say helpful if you want to gather some understanding of the format. And what really makes it good is that you can then discuss this with your friends.
Absolutely. And so we see that Paolo's already rocketed through. You'll see some dice there. This is Anywhere there's a common that Paolo would want 2 of in his deck, he's putting a little dice with a 2 on it just to make life a little bit clearer for us. And it seems like he's got some very strong opinions on there being a number of commons that he always wants to have in his Simic decks.
So he's almost done there. It looks like he's putting a premium on the evolved creatures. It seems like. And
evolve, the keyword mechanic of Simic. It's clear that if you can get lots of evolved creatures, potentially they can work quite well together. And he was quite merrily putting 2s on all sorts of things, and it seems like he's now trimming back a little bit on that because he's realised that there's perhaps not so much space. The one rare that Paolo has gone for looks to be that Master Biomancer.
Yes, that's Master Biomancer, 4 mana, 2/4.
That's correct, yeah. And every time a creature you control enters the battlefield, it gets an additional number of +1/+1 counters equal to Master Biomancer's power, and becomes a mutant in addition to its other types. The mutant perhaps not quite as relevant as all of that extra power.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to see if Master Biomancer can make a splash and construct it as well. A very powerful effect that also stacks. It's not a legend, so you can play as many as you want. But this is limited, so we've asked the players to only play one of each, one rare in total. And it says a lot that Master Biomancer is PV's pick of choice.
So, yeah, a bit of a curve already forming there for Paolo, like focusing more on the pictures on the text, which is great for us because it means we get a chance to enjoy some of the artwork. And we see that Antti here, back on Boros, look at that curve. Yeah. Lots and lots of 2-drops there.
We see that's 8 different 2-drops, but he also has dice on 3 of them. So we are looking at potentially 11 2-drops just from Antti Malin's Boros deck.
So looking to go out there quite aggressively, and interesting that Syndic of Tithes, technically more of an Orzhov card, but one that's got a nice place here in Boros 2, that the 1 colourless and 1 white for a 2/2 that has the Extort mechanic.
Yeah, Extort giving the Boros deck and the Orzhov decks, of course, a tremendous late game reach, and especially in a deck where you want to get your opponent as low as possible. That's a great way to end games, but it's also never bad on curve.
So it looks like Antti hedging his bets a little bit on what rare he wants, perhaps waiting to see how his curve looks. We see a little pile of rares just off to the right-hand side there, and one thing to talk about with Boros is they do have a lot of rares that are very powerful.
Yes, and now, of course, in draft you're usually going to take the ones you can get, but here it's really interesting to see which one is the card I want the most. Aurelia the War Leader being very powerful, but it does cost 6. Aurelia's Fury, similar problems. If you have only 5 mana, then it's just not that amazing. So maybe it's going to be a Boros Reckoner?
Boros Reckoner, of course, the 3/3 for Boros, if you will, that you can pay another Boros Mariner to give it first strike, and any damage that it takes, you have the option to then deal an equal amount of damage back to another creature or player. So a very powerful card there, and one that we might expect to see some constructed play next weekend at Pro Tour Gatecrash.
I took the liberty to snug that Armored Transport into the Boros pile, because I think it's an amazing card for the Boros deck. The 2/1 artifact for 3 that doesn't receive damage when it's attacking. So
the Boros deck's, of course, wanting to attack at every turn and be able to have attackers that are surviving to trigger Battalion. Now, interestingly, let's have a look at the creatures that he has here. The curve looks to be topping out at 4, and there are a few Battalion options in there. So we can see that there is
Daring Skyjack.
Daring Skyjack's the big one. So that's the 3/1 for 1 white and 1 colourless that with Battalion gains flying, so it can more consistently keep attacking in and keep things going.
Makes for very interesting combat decisions starting on turn 3. Do you attack? Do you hold back? Do you wait for Battalion? How is your game plan? I really like that about this mechanic.
And we see that of the spells that Antti's chosen, only one of them currently 2 copies of, that being Mugging. 1 mana for 2 damage at sorcery speed, which at this point looks a little bit like a worse version of Shock. But then additionally to that, it means that the creature that's been hit by Mugging simply can't block. So all of a sudden you're in a situation where good against small creatures, but equally it can be good at forcing through more damage.
In traditional Magic theory, you would always want this to kill a creature so that the second ability isn't really relevant. But sometimes if you want to attack with Battalion, then the secondary effect is actually what you want, and you're just going to win the game because of it.
Now, interestingly here, looking at Simic, one thing to bear in mind is that actually Simic doesn't really have a lot of options in terms of straightforward removal spells. Paolo here, he's got the Simic Charm, he's got a couple of copies of Hands of Binding, the Dimir spell with its ability to be ciphered and coded onto a creature, and then one copy of Totally Lost. But he's very much more focused on getting his creatures, getting that evolve chain going.
And we have to keep in mind that the Blood Rush mechanic also means that a card like Slaughterhorn can be used as a combat trick in a whim. And with a turn 1, Experiment 1, or a Cloudfin Raptor, he does have three 1-drops. It's actually not that important to have removal as long as you are the aggressor in the game. I also really like Frilled Oculus. It does look doesn't look too amazing if you look at it as a 2-mana 1/3. When you realize that giving this creature +2/+2 actually makes it a 3/5, then you get some amazing value.
And comparing the Boros and the Simic decks, having that 1/3, it gives you a great opportunity to just say, I've got an answer to some of the early aggression that's coming through. I'm able to get to my late game, build up my evolve curve.
We also saw some of the more expensive options for Paolo there. Simic Swimmer, I believe it's called. The Nimbus Swimmer. Okay, so you pay X, a green and a blue, and you get an XX flying creature.
And flying an interesting element to the Simic deck, because obviously at the very top of that curve, where we have the Sapphire Drake, it gives all of the creatures, it's a 4/4 flyer on its own for 6 mana, but it gives all of the creatures you have with +1/+1 counters the flying ability. So potentially, if you have that good evolve curve, then you can take some of your Shamble Sharks, your Experiment 1s, various of the other creatures that do have evolve, and just say, look, they're all flying over now, can you deal with it?
And there's a pair of cards that interact with +1/+1 counters, Kron Ceratok being the other one, and PV decided to go with both of these uncommons for his Simic deck, and I think we can see why.
So we see that Antti has now finished his build, it would seem. Boros Rekna, the choice that he's made in terms of which rare, and based on what we can see from this deck, it makes a lot of sense why. This is all about curving out this deck, getting lots of creatures on the board and being able to make an aggressive start, and Boros Rekna are a fantastic choice for doing that. We see that he's got a fairly even split on lands. He's including a Guildgate there because there's not actually as many 1-drops as all that. He chose not to play with any of the other 1-drops available to him, realistically, not actually that many to choose from. Foundry Street Denizen, not one that made the cut.
Yeah, also not the greatest, especially in a Boros deck where you want your creatures to just be stronger than that. And I believe that Antti decided to go with 16 lands only, which is pretty easy when you look at his curve. It basically stops at 3. He has one more 4-mana creature, but that has Blood Rush, so it's also a 3-mana spell. And then he still decided to include one Boros Guildgate to have a small amount of fixing. Sometimes you mulligan, you don't have that many lands, and you're happy to have that Guildgate next to one of the other basic lands. Better than just drawing 2 planes, for example, and not being able to cast your red spells.
And while Battalion is the Boros mechanic, and it's certainly something that can lead to some very powerful draws, it's not actually as big a part of this deck as it could be. And we see that there's Wojek Halberdiers there, the 3/2 for a red and a white that gains first strike when you're attacking with Battalion. And then we also do have the Daring Skyjack that we mentioned earlier, but Battalion more a sort of a nice extra feature than the real focus of that deck.
And a 3/2 for a white and a red is amazing on its own.
Absolutely.
So if your opponent doesn't have a blocker immediately, you just get in there.
The Evolve mechanic, a far bigger part of the deck that Paolo's put together here, and we can see that, interestingly, Paolo has sort of focused far more on creatures than on spells. Just the 4 spells in deck in total. He's not chosen to load up heavily on anything more than simply getting creatures on the board, He's got the Slaughterhorn there to potentially get a little bit of extra pump there, an extra sneaky spell within his creature pile. But ultimately, the Simic deck looking to curve out neatly again, but in quite a different way, and try and build up these massive evolved creatures.
And don't underestimate Zamek Guildmage, giving the Simic deck another amazing late game card.
So, looking at the deck from the 1-drops, we've got Experiment 1 and Cloudfin Raptor, 3 evolved creatures at 1. Then Shamble Sharkar, 1 evolved creature at 2. Zamek Guildmage obviously enabling evolve in a great way. Then once we get to 3, the 1 elusive Krasis. An interesting one, this one. Starts off as a 0/4, but it is unblockable, so once it gets a few counters on it with evolve, and it will evolve given it's got 0 power, potentially a big threat. Master Biomancer at 4, a huge linchpin to this deck. It'd be interesting to see whether or not, without Biomancer in the deck, if it was going to have quite the same curve of creatures at all. Ivy Lane Denizen, of course, also another great way of getting +1/+1 counters onto even some of those creatures, like the Krasis at 3 that naturally doesn't have evolve. And then Leyline Phantom. Now this is an interesting one. The 5/5 for 4 and a colorless that whenever it deals combat damage, it returns to its owner's hand. This is one that enables evolve in a great way, and perhaps that's more of the reason it's in there than simply attacking and blocking.
You can also combo off with Zamek Guildmage, just drawing cards each turn and continuing the chain of evolved creatures. Nimbus Swimmer, an interesting card. If you cast it for 3 or 4 mana, it's really not that strong, but we see that PV put it in the 5-drop slot, where it starts to get really amazing.
And with a standard 17 lands, nothing too unusual there in terms of the mana base, a nice even curve, and then just a couple of Hands of Binding and a couple of other spells just to round out that deck in what gives a feel for how Simic is going to work.
Yeah, putting an emphasis on the tempo aspect of that archetype.
Absolutely. So we'll be coming back shortly to give you another couple of overviews of how particular guilds might work, but we'll check back with that real soon. So that just a first quick look at how a couple of the guilds' draft decks might look. I know there's maybe a little bit of confusion there. Just to be clear, today is sealed deck day. We're not really trying to get ahead of ourselves. We just wanted to get a little bit of a feel for maybe if you did want to build a deck that was just one guild, and maybe in a draft context how that might go. So that was Paolo and Antti each building their respective guilds with just the 1 rare, up to 1 of any common, and up to 2 of any common, and up to 1 of any uncommon. Now, one of the interesting things I thought there, Simon, which grad do you go for?
That's probably the most splashy decision you have to make, and I think it told us a lot about the general format, but also about the guild identities. That, for example, in Boros, you don't necessarily want an expensive 6-drop, even though it's insanely powerful, but you'd rather have the efficient package of Boros Reckoner.
And this is interesting. We were having a conversation yesterday about how some of the more expensive Boros rares, especially in draft, which is quite a quick format, they could almost feel like a bit of a trap, that they're trying to take you off in a direction that maybe your perfect Boros deck doesn't want to go in.
That's always a very interesting decision. Do you go with the power, so that whatever your draw is, you just have this 1 card that you can just slam down and have the most powerful effect possible? Or do you really want the most cohesive deck? And then you just have to say, I want 16 lands, I don't want that 6-drop.
I mean, speaking to someone last night, they were suggesting that maybe secretly, if you open a pack with Assemble the Legion in, very, very powerful card, 3 colorless, a red and a white, to have an enchantment that gradually makes 1 token with haste the first upkeep, 2 the next, and more over the course of the game. Maybe you actually secretly want to be an Orzhov with that card. Perhaps actually that deck that wants to be a little bit slower is better suited to making all of those tokens than the Boros deck that really maybe just wants to have a curve that stops at 4.
When you look at an aggressive deck, this is all. Assemble the Legion is a card that really is at its best at turn 7, turn 8, the earliest. So it's not an aggressive card by definition.
So a little bit of variety there, and we did see that With Simic, actually, perhaps spells aren't nearly as important as making sure you have lots of creatures to constantly be moving along your evolution chain.
Yes, and the big task for Simic is how to interact with your opponent's creatures. I think that's going to be a theme throughout the weekend.
And just to be clear on like some of the details on how that exercise works, we wanted to be really focused on just the one guild. It may well be that in point of fact, if you're Simic, you kind of want to be splashing a little bit, or you're happy to pick up a few pit fights off the Gruul people to be able to get some sort of a way of getting removal in there, even if it's not naturally in the little arc that's just your part of the colour pie naturally.
This was just a stylized, idealized version.
So don't treat these as the best decks and this is exactly what you want to copy, but it does begin to give you an idea of, and especially for the Boros one, I think the big bit of news for me is just, if you're looking at something that costs 4 or more, it needs to be really good before you start thinking about putting it in your Boros deck.
Yeah, you can easily pick up too many 4-drops and then you have a Boros deck, but then it also means you need to wait till turn 5 until you can attack with Battalion for the first time, and 2-drops just do the job better.
And Battalion, the interesting one there too. We saw that, in fact, Anti-Malin not necessarily going for so much Battalion, just little bits here and there. The creatures that are good anyway without Battalion, then getting an extra boost on top in addition to that. So, for example, the Wojek Halberdiers, if it didn't have Battalion, I'm pretty sure I'd be happy to run it in a Boros deck anyway.
If it has 3 power for 2 mana, it's probably a pretty good card.
So that the way that the Boros deck went, the Simic deck, Paolo Vitor Damarosa. In point of fact, the first time I saw Paolo drafting Simic was the day after the pre-release. We got together, Paolo was in London for the pre-release, played a couple of different pre-releases, and then the following day we scrabbled together just about enough packs from people's winnings to be able to get a couple of drafts in, and that was the first time that Paolo got a chance to try drafting with Simic.
Always the most exciting times, I think. Right after the pre-release, you've played with the cards, you have the packs, your first packs, but you have no idea how the draft format looks like.
Yeah, and it was one of those ones where it took a bit of discipline, I must say. I came third in my pre-release and had the big pile of packs in my hand to hold on to them and not to just crack them open and see what was in there, but to get a little bit of extra value out of them by being able to get 8 players together and get a draft going.
So did PV do well with his Simic build?
He did pretty well. He was no slouch.
He's somewhat of a natural, isn't he?
He's had a bit of practice too, and when you combine those two things together, it can get messy pretty quickly. But PV, just one of the many people that's travelled from all around the world to come to this tournament, because we know that, of course, the Pro Tour in Montreal is happening just next weekend. That's the first chance we get to see Gatecrash standard on the big stage. But lots of pros very keen to get a feel for the format. So yes, Paolo's come. Yes, Jackie Lee and Christian Calcano have come from the US, but also a whole host of European pros. So Yuka Soklovsky, this is in fact his pre-release. Due to commitments that he had, he wasn't able to play within the pre-release in the Czech Republic. Instead, he was able to say, well, actually, no, I'm going to come to London, I'm going to find out about how it all works when I've got 6 regular packs. There's not the pre-release pack that's allocated to one guild specifically, but he gets a chance to play at the highest level from the get-go.
It might actually be a good idea to have a clear mind, basically, just see what happens. A lot of people here would have liked more experience with the set, but that's what happens when you release a new set. You just have to also let your intuition guide you, your experience guide you.
Absolutely, and this, of course, right around the time that the set becomes available to play on Magic the Gathering Online, and so all of a sudden, a wealth of information feeding through from this event that can then, there's a week or so for the pros to potentially get loads and loads of drafts in online prior to the big show starting just next week.
I mean, drafting on Magic Online, one of my favorite pastimes, so
absolutely.
It's a bummer I have to be here.
And I'm sure I'm going to be playing a few release events on Magic Online in the next week or so. But equally, just sort of being in a spot to be able to say, I've got a busy job, I can't necessarily make every FNM, I can't necessarily make... London actually has quite a good draft scene, Monday and Tuesday nights as well, one can go out and draft quite easily. But at the same time, for those of us with jobs, sometimes it's easier to go, you know what, I'm get home, I'm going to put my food on, and then, you know, the draft's my oyster.
So we have 19 and 70 people here. Isn't that also because London has just a great pool for people from Great Britain, but also from Europe?
I mean, London obviously has lots of great transport links, but yes, there are a lot of active players in London, and we do tend to have pretty bustling pre-releases, it must be said, and there's a good core of players playing most nights of the week. If anyone's ever in town, then yeah, looking up events that are going on in London, there's normally something going on. If you're looking for a game, you shouldn't have too much trouble.
Oh, there's enough people here, enough players. So.
Absolutely. A thriving metropolis of magic, and me just the metropolis sprite that doesn't know where my power lives. But we're just sort of closing out the fourth round now, so we should comparatively soon have our feature matches for round 5. The pairings just gone up, so we're seeing various people sprinting across what is, as needs to be for a nearly 2,000 player GP, quite a large room. And we should have our feature match pairings very, very shortly indeed, so we'll bring those across to you as soon as we get them.
So we're going to start round 5 of 10 today. And
whoa, we're nearly halfway there.
Yeah, so for most pros, this is only the second round. And
an interesting dynamic at that, actually, that those players with 3 buys, I mean, I was speaking to Neil Rigby, who came in this event without any buys, but has started off on a 3-0 start. Neil, one of our top English players, and he was sort of saying, I don't really mind if I get paired against a pro in round 4, because while they're obviously an amazing player, I know that I've opened a really good pool, but it's entirely possible that one of the pros that's got 3 buys could have just happened to not quite open the cards that are going to be able to compete with me.
Yeah, that was always a big thing. Like when you have these 3 buys, do you actually want to play against a pro, or do you want to play against somebody who went 3-0 just without any buys? Because he's going to have just a pretty good deck.
And thinking of people that sort of perhaps haven't had as easy a start, Quentin Martin, another one of the English players who's had a fair amount of Pro Tour success, actually made top 8 in Prague, where it was the original Ravnica limited format. 2006, quite a while ago, one of my first Pro Tours on coverage, actually. He's for the first time ever not started his tournament at 3-0. Obviously, some of that time he had buys. Right now, due to work commitments, he's not able to play quite as much. And on a 2-1 start, he's now in the gambit. He wasn't going to play against a pro in round 4. Potentially in round 5 he might do, but not one necessarily with the most powerful of decks.
Yeah, and you can only afford 2 losses if you want to advance today too.
So yeah, he's virtually on the bubble, but enjoying himself nonetheless. And one of the fun things for me about a Grand Prix in England is it's a good chance to catch up with all sorts of the English players that, while we have a very sort of busy scene in London, we don't necessarily see players from all around the country down here all the time. You know, for the PTQs, and that's about it sometimes. But there's people coming out the woodwork from all over the place. I've already seen Mark Wraith, the English national or UK national champion from 1996 here, keen to be playing again and enjoying himself very much. When a new set comes out, you find that all of a sudden there's ample opportunity for players from the entire history of the game to come back and have a go. Ola Rade, the Hall of Famer from Sweden, also here, checking out the set, enjoying his time in London, and all sorts of players really enjoying themselves in this new Gatecrash format. So, looks like they're just making a few decisions around feature matches now. Hopefully we'll receive them across shortly. And players bustling to their seats. This being a room that's sort of, as much as we'd expected it to be big, I don't know if anyone really expected it to be quite this big in London. For a minute or two they were scrambling around for just the last seats. We had to make sure we were sat down at just the right moment so that we would have seating rather than being kneeling behind this desk for coverage.
Yeah, we had over 1,400 registrations yesterday, and then we barely scratched the mark of 2,000 players.
Yeah, just 30 players off, like an FNM away from it being a 2,000 player tournament.
So we are on an island, but people from all over Europe still came here, probably by plane mostly.
Planes, trains, automobiles, with the Eurotunnel and the London City Airport, which is just a stone's throw away from the venue. It's been a very easy one for people to travel to, and people clearly have travelled excited about the opportunity to play with Gatecrash. But we should find that we're ready to start soon. We've seen almost all the guilds already in the feature match area. Do you think that there's any guild that are sort of particularly better or worse suited? I mean, we spoke about green being clearly a powerful colour for sealed because of its mana fixing. Are there any sort of guilds that you personally would lean more towards or against in terms of building a sealed deck?
I think I prefer personally to just let the cards themselves reveal themselves to me. Like sometimes your pool is really trying to tell you something, and I think you should always listen to that. And then you also, the next thing you look at is how powerful is this pool in relation to what the other people are going to open, and that means it's going to tell you which risks you want to take.
Okay.
So if you are on the above average power level pool, then you can just go 2 colors and be done with it. Mm-hmm. If you see that a 2-color deck is just going to be worse than what more than half of the people in the room are going to be fighting with, then what you want to be doing is maybe go for a crazy 5-color deck or mix it up completely. So, or another alternative is to just go a completely aggressive strategy, even though you're playing some subpar cards, just because it's going to give you the best chances of winning.
So we have now got our feature matches, and it looks like we have a very Nordic feel in our feature match area for round 5. So on the first match that we're starting with, we have Joel Larsson from Sweden against Kenny Oberg from Sweden. Those two are the top Swedish pros. And then on table 2, Elias Watzfeldt, also from Sweden, against Christian Bakkerhog from Norway. So the Vikings have invaded our feature match area, and we'll be seeing a great deal of them on camera.
Nordic by nature.
Stanislav Sivka is against Samuela Estrati, the battle of the recent Pro Tour winners in text. A nice little backup on video, but you'll be able to read all of that one in the text feature match. And then, as if that wasn't enough, good old Raf Levy in the feature match area against Kirill Tsakov of Russia. So they're then just all sitting down there. We can see them shuffling up. Probably for the best that we don't have microphones on various of these matches, because a lot of them might end up being in Swedish. And
yeah. Or some other Scandinavian language.
Indeed. My knowledge of Swedish, a little bit flaky at best. But Joel Larsson, spoke to him earlier on today. He's actually been in London for a few days now with relatives over here. He's had the opportunity to check out the city a little bit, do a bit of sightseeing. He'll be flying out to Montreal shortly after this weekend. And up against Kenny Oberg, who's no slouch either. I mean, Kenny had a bit of a heartbreak last season, had thought that he was going to be able to be in charge of the Swedish team during the World Magic Cup, but was pipped to the post by the likes of Deniz Rashid, who, having had 2 top 8s, was just able to rack up a whole mountain of pro points and beat him to the punch there.
Quietly overtaking him. Now, I'm somewhat confused by these pairings. I'm not sure if these point numbers are correct, because it looks like people have only 3 wins, but I think some of those people must have 4 wins, right?
I believe so, yeah. But in terms of us picking out who we want to look at, I'm sure that will work out just fine. And looking at the way that we got Oberg against Larsson, I can't honestly believe that they're not both 4-0.
Well, I did read a tweet by Kenny, which stated exactly the opposite, namely that he lost his first round.
Well, in which case, this is a high-pressure match for a whole different reason, that when you're suddenly a little bit closer to the bubble, you certainly don't want to get paired up against another pro, and especially not, one of your friends. I'm sure that all the Swedes rooting for each other to get as many of them through to day 2 as possible. So Kenny on our left here, and Joel on the right with a rather striking finger ring on there. So we can't see his over-the-top hairstyle, but we can see his over-the-top jewellery here. And we'll see them rolling to go first very, very shortly.
and Kenny actually beats the 3 with a 4. And
you don't have to be a high roller to be good at Magic, but it helps.
It does help. Now, I suspect that he's going to start, but who knows? Maybe we're going to see some draw first games in this matchup. It's also very likely that the two know what they're up against.
That they may have spoken to each other during the buys.
Or even tested some games. So it looks like Kenny actually chose to go first, and it looks like he's Gruul.
Yeah, stomping ground into Mountain. A Gaia Sage there. Now, Gaia Sage, an innocuous enough looking mana accelerator, but potentially if you start casting some big creatures, it can get out of hand very, very quickly indeed.
So if Kenny has a 3 or 4 drop here,
if he has a 3 drop, then he could make all sorts of trouble happen. And lo and behold, there it is. So that a Warmind Infantry, meaning that immediately the Gaia Sage becomes a
2/3.
A 2/3 creature. Kenny there, not able to make the most of the 1 mana it can tap for at present, so he simply attacks. But as it gets bigger, that's only going to get more of a threat and enable him to power out more powerful Gruul threats. And a Slate Street Ruffian on the other side of the board, not necessarily quite as imposing, shall we say. The 2/2 that whenever it becomes blocked, the defending player discards a card, not matching up too well against the 2/2/3s that Kenny Oberg has already deployed.
Yeah, this is looking quite a lot weaker than what Kenny is doing. Also being stuck on only black lands, he has shown himself to be Orzhov from the contents of his hand, and this is certainly not the position he wants to be in.
Kenny quite happy to rumble in again, presumably meaning that even if he's got another threat here, it's not going to be one that pumps his Gaia Sage up to the point where he can cast yet another threat on top after that.
So yeah, that probably means he doesn't have a creature that pumps up Gaia Sage. He wouldn't play that post-combat. So kind of, it's just a Cinder Elemental.
Just a Cinder Elemental. What a nice spot to be in, eh? Cinder Elemental, of course, the 2/2 for 3 and a red, with a fairly nifty ability in as much as you can pay X and a red and sacrifice it to deal X damage to target creature or player.
We do see quite a nice Cypher spell from Joel there.
Call of the Nightwing there, so he's immediately been able to make a 1/1 blue and black flying creature, and he's encoded that Call of the Nightwing onto his Slate Street Ruffian. So now Kenny Oberg faced with a bit of a choice. Either he blocks with his Cinder Elemental, trading with that Ruffian. Now by blocking it, he has to discard a card and loses his 2/2 that can burn something out. Or he takes 2 and faces down another 1/1 flyer.
Yeah, and then he's facing the same decision again next turn. So even though Cinder Elemental is quite powerful, you might just want to block there, depending on your hand.
Or if he leaves it 1 turn, at least he could use the Cinder Elemental to burn away the Slate Street Ruffian and not have to discard.
Oh, true. One other thing is that Battalion it's just a minor bonus, but giving that Warmind Infantry +2/+0 is not irrelevant.
Yoel Larson, of course, currently a little bit on the back foot, so it is kind of a situation where Kenny Oberg will be looking to push the advantage if he can.
Do you remember when Cinder Elemental first appeared?
That would have been Mercadian Masks?
Yeah, that could be it.
Back in Mercadian Masks, Cinder Elemental so far above the power curve for many creatures that it was simply spectacular. Now, still very good, but not so good that Kenny Oberg not willing to block and trade there.
Yeah. So let's call him the reverse Stealer of Secrets, did his job after all. A Cypher spell can do a pretty good job of that.
I mean, it took a Skinbrand Goblin out of Kenny Oberg's hand as well, forced the discard there by having blocked. So certainly not without merit. And Larson now, while he's got the island, he's passing without a spell, so A trick coming, perhaps, one must assume.
Yeah, as I said, he is an Orzhov deck, so he just drew his splash color and is still looking for planes.
So a difficult spot here for Joel Larsson, whereas Kenny Oberg, even just with what he has on the board, he's up on material, he's got plenty of cards in hand, in a nice spot.
Kenny has deployed quite a lot of lands, including a Boros Guildgate, so he's also apparently splashing some white cards, maybe additional removal. We saw Bernd Brandemühl play Angelic Edict.
Yes, a nice easy splash there, 4 colorless and a white to remove, so exile target creature or enchantment, and it'll be interesting to see whether or not that's the extent of Oberg's splash, or if he perhaps has one of those splashy rares. Oh, called it. A Foundry Champion there. Now when it comes into play, it deals damage equal to the number of creatures you control to target creature or player. With Larsson being on 6, it seems not unlikely he's just going to go straight for Larsson's head there. And it evolves his Gaia Sage up a little bit more, puts Larsson in a really rough spot, because now that Foundry Champion's in play, it is still a 4/4 that you can pay red mana to pump its power and white mana to pump its toughness. So a big threat on the board. And as we were saying earlier on, those Boros rares, sometimes they're at the best in some of the other guilds.
Yes, simply because the Boros deck doesn't necessarily want the 6-drop, but I think that Joel is just trying to get a look at Kenny's hand here before conceding.
Yeah, Vizkopa Confessor, he pays the life to get a look at the hand, but ultimately the fact that there's a forest in there doesn't mean he's got any respite. He's scooping up his cards. So Kenny Oberg wins the first game there against Joel Larsson. Larsson very much on the back foot. Both players immediately going to their sideboard. It looks like Kenny may already have a plan as to slight tweaks to make to his deck ready for the second game. Only slight movements from Joel there. So, Gaia Sage, my first experience with Gaia Sage was one of the more unpleasant experiences I've had in Gatecrash Limited thus far, in as much as it immediately got evolved in pretty much the most brutal fashion possible, which is to say that there was a Burning Tree Emissary immediately into another 2-drop, which in turn meant that he could tap it for a third 2-drop in the same turn. And all of a sudden, from nowhere, when I had been facing down 1 creature, I was facing down 4. Gaia Sage, one of those cards that I think initially I had perhaps underestimated, but if you've got a fairly aggressive draw anyway, it turns it into a very aggressive draw very quickly.
It looks like it is a bit clunky because you don't get mana immediately, but you have to realize that every creature just adds to your mana pool, basically, every turn.
And of course, at some point, Gaia Sage becomes a big enough creature that it can simply get stuck in the red zone and you don't mind too much. Paying 2 mana for a creature that ends up being a 2/3 or a 3/4 with little effort is perfectly reasonable in itself.
And given how high of a pick, how good of a card Experiment 1 is, a 1/1 with Evolve, then you're just getting a 1/2 with Evolve, which is slightly worse for 2 mana, but then again, it has this ability that just allows for these starts you just described.
And Gruul, of course, one of the colours that actually has the best things to accelerate into. Ruination Worm at 4 colours, a red and a green, a 7/6 that just dominates board state. And if you can bring it into play a turn or 2 earlier, that can be just a backbreaking play.
Especially because it's so difficult to block it with all the Blood Rush going on.
Yes, normally double blocking a big creature, not the worst of plays because combat tricks perhaps not so prevalent, with Blood Rush around, all of a sudden, doing so could just be putting a large number of your creatures in the bin for the cost of one Blood Rushed creature going in the other side.
One thing that's important to remember is that there isn't that much unconditional instant removal in the set. So you can actually just use these Blood Rush effects. You can put auras on your creatures without being so afraid of that creature just dying this or the next turn. And that makes it even more important to play for board position whenever you have the chance.
So it looks like Joel Larsen has done some sneaky sideboarding here, because all of a sudden, from looking at his starting hand, he's a Gruul deck too.
Didn't we see that before?
We did in our match with Bernd Brenbuhl last round. That it seems like if you're trying to be the control deck and you find yourself against Gruul, sometimes your best bet is to try and beat them by joining them.
I believe it was very similar. We saw an Esper deck switching into Gruul, and Joel is basically doing the exact same thing.
So Joel on the play here, and starting it out with a Croconura. This the 1/3 reach evolve creature. And evolve actually really quite powerful when you've got the big green creatures and big red-green creatures of Gruul, because it just means that you can trigger it that much more often. Not quite as exciting a start this time from Kenny Oberg. The armoured transport that he's put out there, normally something you're more likely to see from a Boros deck. It's something that can attack in battalion very well indeed. Perhaps not quite as good in Gruul?
Not quite, but it's not an unblockable creature, but it's very similar in the sense that you can always attack with it. And when you consider cards like all the Blood Rush creatures and the combat tricks, maybe something like the Battle Growth reprint that puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature, then that ability doesn't look that wrong anymore.
Now, we got a little bit of a peek at Kenny Oberg's hand there, and there's some exciting things a-brewing for Kenny Oberg. Amongst other things, he has one of my favourite commons in the set in Madcap Skills. One colourless and a red enchant creature. Gives that creature +3 power and means it can't be blocked apart by 2 or more creatures.
How's that on armor transport?
Yeah, all of a sudden, the fact that it's not taking damage when it's attacking means that it creates a horrible position for Joel Larsen. That Warmind infantry couldn't block even if it wanted to, and double blocking something with 5 power that's not even going to die is it's a terrible position to be in. And then at some point, should Kenny get up to 7 mana, there's a Scarred Goliath in his hand. Now, Scarred Goliath, it is a 9/9 trampler that you can pay for 6 colourless and 2 green mana, but perhaps more excitingly, for 7 mana, 5 colourless and 2 green, you can give target attacking creature +9/+9 and trample, which there's every possibility that we might see in this game. If Kenny can be alive in 2 more turns, he can potentially just completely end this game with just the 1 creature.
So Kenny, being on the draw this game, has built himself a 4-turn clock, but he does need some blockers. Otherwise, he's just going to go down to Warmind Infantry, Croconura, and Ember Beast, which are threatening to deal 6, 10, maybe 11 damage next turn.
And Ivy Lane Denizen there, another card that I hold in fairly high regard. The fact that it's a 2/3 to start with for 3 colours and a green that can make all your creatures potentially bigger by placing a +1/+1 counter on a creature whenever you play a green creature. It does an awful lot for a very reasonable cost. And unsurprising there, seeing that Joel Larsen gets rid of it just as soon as he can with what looks to be a Homing Lightning. Homing Lightning, one of the few instant seed removal spells in the set, really. And a Madcap Skills on Joel Larsen's side on the board as well. Now meaning that Oberg probably on the losing end of this race. Warmind Infantry attacking with Battalion to become a 4/3. Croconura a 3/6, and then Ember Beast a 6/4 thanks to Madcap Skills.
For exactly 13.
Exactly 13. Joel Larsen snatched that back and forced it to a rubber game. So Larsson now, does he switch back when he's on the draw? Does he play a little game with Kenny, or is he just going to go for a relatively minor adjustment? We'll find out the answer to that a little bit later, because we've moved across to table 2 now. Table 2, of course, being where we have Elias Watsfeld against Christian Bakahog of Norway. Please feel free to let me know in the chat whether or not I'm pronouncing these names right. I'd very much like to learn. And an angelic edict there from Watsfeld on the right of our screen in order to deal with what might otherwise have been quite a difficult to remove Osterriethem. This, a straightforward Orzhov mirror, and it looks like that's all over that game. We've switched across all too briefly.
Elias didn't stand a chance there. He was facing off against an overwhelming advantage, and the Deptos pulpit put the nail in their coffin.
So it looks like both of our video matches, they're trying to get full value out of the feature match area with its comfy chairs. All going to a deciding game. This match now 1-1 as well. Watsfeld looking for final movements, and we'll likely now be zipping back across, I would imagine, to see what's going on with the Kenny Oberg match against Joel Larsson. So we'll be back with that shortly, though there's shuffling going on all over the shop though, so we thought we'd show you a few different sets of sleeves, and indeed the back of some magic cards in the case of Elias Watsfeld's deck.
Elias, who was the runner-up at GP Lisbon, we covered at the end of last year, where he played some amazing limited magic in Return to Ravnica. So I'm going to be very interested to see if he can keep that up with Gatecrash, how much he has prepared, and how he feels heading into the Pro Tour.
Yeah, Watsfeld, and in fact the Swedes in general, having a really great run at the moment, consistently putting up numbers and testing together and really showing the impact of being well prepared for formats. They've had good decks at a lot of the Pro Tours recently and been seeing results of consequence.
Preparing as a team, bouncing back and forth ideas and decks as well, really pays off. So it does look like Joel is sticking to Gruul. We've talked about boarding into another guild for strategic reasons, but there's a much simpler reasons for that as well if you just want to fix some mistakes you made during deck building.
So we just briefly wanted to show you quite how busy the room is here. A huge amount of players have come across to London to be able to play in this Grand Prix. And from the feature match area, Stephen Leeming, our bold, courageous cameraman, getting up very high to get us a good shot of all across the room. And now, is he in a helicopter? How's he doing this? This is magical in a whole different sense to what we normally see.
I can actually see him, and it looks like a helicopter from here.
And we see that Kenny Oberg has started with his Gaia Sage once more, this time up against Experiment 1 from Joel Larsson. It'll be interesting to see who wins the Evolve War here.
Gaia Sage is up to a fast start with the help of Ember Beast. So being on the play in these Gruul mirrors certainly doesn't hurt.
Absolutely not. And stomping ground again from Kenny, meaning that in this case he's not got too much to worry about in terms of mana consistency. At some point I guess he might need that second green mana if he wants to cast the likes of a Scarred Goliath perhaps. But for now I'm sure he'll content himself with simply having a fairly dominating board presence.
One thing that's important to keep in mind is that Experiment 1 is not only 1/1 with the Evolve, but you can also regenerate it at the cost of 2 +1/+1 counters. So yeah, it becomes almost impossible to kill after a while.
And Croconura there, continuing Joel Larsson's Gruul Evolve chain. Important to remember, of course, that just because a mechanic might be most associated with a guild doesn't mean to say at all that it's not going to work perfectly well in another guild. The other combination that I'm always a big fan of is in the Dimir decks where I'm encoding Cypher cards, getting a little bit of extort going, because you do actually cast the card whenever you play something off a Cypher.
Yeah, there's a lot of cross-guild synergies. We see Kenny, who would have had a very powerful turn if he had another, let's see, a 3-power creature, but it looks like he doesn't, so his Gyre Sage is probably staying home to produce mana rather than attacking, and that would mean that the Ember Beast is as well. If Kenny had a larger creature to play here, Joel would potentially have fallen down to 12 already.
But it looks like Larssen, while he's sort of stable-ish now, he is going to need to keep the pressure up, because one has to assume that it's not going to last, Kenny not having big threats when he's playing Gruul.
But Joel has to be very happy about that turn of events. Only trading his Crocanura for a mugging is much better than getting beaten by a Blood Rush or the aforementioned Evolve triggering.
So it looks like, yeah, with a few options here for Jarl Larssen in terms of his next threat. Another Crocanura being the one that he's going to go for. So the reach perhaps not as interesting to him as having something that he knows is going to evolve his Experiment 1 and is equally able to block effectively. And a nice little blocker there. This is one of the Blood Rush creatures that I actually strongly prefer in play rather than anywhere else. Wasteland Viper, 1 mana for a 1/2 Death Touch, but with Blood Rush that you can give +1/+2 and Death Touch for just 1 green mana.
Very good answer to that Ember Beast or the Gyre Sage. If Kenny decides to attack with both, then Joel has a pretty easy block because Crocanura can block the Gyre Sage. But if Kenny plays another creature, then things probably change. It's possible that Kenny has a creature, but would have to tap his Gyre Sage for it, so that his Ember Beast would be able to attack as well. I think he wants to keep up that momentum, but doesn't have an easy way to do so.
So Kenny having a little bit of a think here. One would have to assume that if he did have the big creature, it might have hit play already. He's carefully planning out his plays, which is kind of the hallmark of the way that Kenny plays. And I find Kenny a really entertaining player to watch, because you know that when he's making a decision, he's thinking it through properly, and there's a good chance he's making the right one. And a Warmind Infantry on Kenny's side of the board. We saw one from Jarl last game, along with a Boros Guildgate to threaten potentially that splashed Foundry Champion all over again.
So Kenny's the first person to hit the brakes here, to go on the defensive. Even though the Joel's creatures weren't that threatening, there was just no way to get a profitable attack in. And that Gyre Sage is actually quite valuable to Kenny.
Yeah, I mean, the difference between having 5 mana and potentially having 6 or 7 while he's still got multiple cards in hand, potentially substantial.
He might also be holding another combat trick for up to 2 mana, potentially.
Experiment 1 getting in. I just think that Kenny's probably okay with taking 3 here.
The interesting thing is always that Ember Beast. It makes for a very, very awkward attacking and blocking decisions sometimes. Sometimes you're forced to just attack with everything, or to get into a double block that you don't really want. So, yeah, we see Kenny taking 3 here, also because he doesn't want to lose his team to a Blood Rush trick.
So everyone's got some war on their mind with their Warmind Infantries, but it looks like Kenny not in quite so convenient position here. Again, he's able to play his land easily enough, but after that, a little bit slow to follow up.
Looks like he's down to 2 cards.
That's correct, yes.
So I assume that he is contemplating his options here and not just sitting there with a couple of lands. So if he does have, in fact, have a card like Foundry Champion, he's easily back into this game. But he does need something to Well, yeah, just to have an impact on the board.
Gaia Sage, very impressive when it is able to be explosive, but this game hasn't really achieved anything beyond being a warm body.
The big turn being turn 4, where instead of just dropping a high-powered creature, he was just casting Prophetic Prism and passing the turn. So, yeah, since then we haven't really seen anything impressive. Casting Warmind Infantry is fine, but you don't want to do it when you have 6 mana available.
Also, exactly the wrong size. Like, even if it had been a 3-2 rather than a 2-3, then we would have seen an extra evolve out of that Gaia Sage. And with every extra +1/+1 counter on the Gaia Sage, it taps for 1 more mana.
Or would have been able to get through that Crocanora earlier, but that has grown now as well, so simply facing off 2 evolved creatures with only a single one on your side that you haven't been able to evolve for a while can be kind of a scary position to be in.
Six mana here from Kenny. Clan Defiance. That's definitely something that will change a board state. Presumably Kenny here was trying to work out exactly which creature he was going to be going for with it.
Probably also contemplating how the damage race is going to work out exactly, because he does deal 4 to Joel on the way, and 11 is something that's actually quite doable with the help of Ember Beast, Warmind Infantry, and that Gaia Sage.
And everything getting stuck in here such that Battalion is triggered for Kenny Oberg. So that Warmind Infantry now at 4-3. And Larson here has to think about what he's going to put his Wasteland Viper in front of. With Death Touch, it will trade with whatever creature it blocks. A little bit of hemming and hawing.
The block on Gaia Sage is a pretty easy one.
But now we see that all of a sudden, just because we say that there aren't that many combat tricks doesn't mean that there's none at all. A Furious Resistance there, giving target blocking creature +3 power and first strike till the end of turn, means that all of a sudden, rather than trading, that Wasteland Viper was simply killing off Warmind Infantry for no gain for Kenny. So a defensive trick there, proving its worth, and for just 1 red mana as well, meant that it was easy for Yoel Larson to disguise. And the Alpha Strike back here, absolutely crippling, as a Zertar Swine on Blood Rush means that Kenny Oberg on 12 life, while he may have felt safe, as it turns out, not remotely safe, Yoel Larson locks up the game and the match, winning the match 2 games to 1. So the 2 Swedish friends there just sort of exchanging a few words, checking out perhaps what was left in each other's hands, and we do the quick leap across to our other match, that match being Elias Watsfeld on the right of our screen against Christian Bakkehaug of Norway. And Watsfeld there just losing one of the other rares in the set that I feel is potentially very powerful, though often more as a spell than as a creature, in Wrecking Ogre, the 3/3 double striker for 5 that has Blood Rush to give target creature +3/+3 and double strike until the end of turn, which can be huge. But that one gone now. Balustrade Spy up against Smog Elemental. I was trying to say Fog Elemental, but I pulled myself back. The City Smog being a 3/3 flyer that means that other opposing flyers get -1/-1, and doing a lot of good work against Balustrade Spy and Basilica Screecher on the other side of the board, both of those creatures flying. So Devour Flesh there, meaning that Balustrade Spy is no longer around. And we can see 11 plays 3 being the life total. This is a game potentially pretty close to completion.
Elias opting to let his opponent keep the bet, as it's only a 0-1 creature with Extort, and both of these players are somewhat out of spells, so Extort not being the most dangerous ability right now.
Whatsfeld playing fast, hungry to finish this game off, one must assume. It looks like I have a sneaking suspicion that was a very powerful draw that we see there from Baccahaug. That is Gideon himself. Now this is not Gideon Jura. Gideon is reincarnated somewhat in Gatecrash. He's now the champion of justice for 4 mana. He starts with 4 loyalty, but that quickly goes up because his +1 ability means that you can put a put a loyalty counter on him for each creature that target opponent controls. Now, having a lot of loyalty, good at keeping planeswalkers alive, but especially good when you can use his second ability to be a creature until the end of the turn that is indestructible and has power and toughness equal to the number of loyalty counters on Gideon. Now, it's unlikely that we're going to see it, but you never know. If Gideon gets up to 15 loyalty counters, he can choose to remove 15 counters to exile all permanents but for himself. Now, that's not so exciting if he's got exactly 15, but if he had 16, so that he's the last thing on the board, could be very hard to fight.
We don't know the life totals, but it's also possible that that 7/7 is just threatening lethal. So that Elias is basically forced to block here already. At least he decided to stay back with his Court Street Denizen.
And that Denizen jumping in the way of Gideon at the first opportunity.
Elias did draw another another Orzhov spell there. Who knows? Maybe he has found something to stay alive, but
Gideon a tricky one to simply kill because indestructibility just doesn't do the trick. And we see that actually the life total's very, very low indeed now. Extortion could easily be the end of this game. Christian Baccahaug may not even need his mythic Gideon Champion of Justice because, in point of fact, 1 spell plus a double extort will do it.
And we can also see that a removal spell for the bad would have been enough to win for Elias here. So, really, whoa.
If you're going to find a spell to extort someone with, Obzedat is exactly the one that, in point of fact, he didn't need to extort because it comes with a built-in extort for 2 just within the cost. Elias Whatsfeld dropping the 3rd game, Christian Baccahaug winning 2 games to 1. We will be zipping off the stream just for a moment or two now that we've hit the end of that round. It'll give us an opportunity to just get a quick drink, prepare for the next round. That was round 5, and with round 6, we'll be seeing a Rich Hagen in the video area for the first time on a GP for a little while now. So for all of you Rich fans out there, stay tuned, we'll be back very, very soon. But from me, Tim Willoughby, and Simon Gertzen here in the coverage area, we're going to take just a quick little break.